Hey friends, today I'm reading yet another new book that I just got called Bones in the White House, Thomas Jefferson's Mammoth. It's a true story about Thomas Jefferson, another story I've never heard before. The author's name is Candice Ransom, illustrator Jamey Christoph. Long ago, tales like campfire smoke drifted across America. They hinted of a monster roaming territories west of the Mississippi River. Thomas Jefferson heard these stories. Surveyors, traders, and trappers staggered back from the wilds of Kentucky with enormous tusks and thrilling accounts of massive bones scattered on the ground. Huge ribs, shoulder blades stuck up from the blue-gray muck, they said. One man reported using gigantic bones as tent poles and stools. In 1781, America was still mostly a vast wilderness. No one in the East knew what mysterious animals might wander in the far West. Jefferson was enthralled. What brute could have left behind such a mighty skeleton? He itched to see those bones. He had always been curious. As a boy, he picked up shells as old as the rocks in the Blue Ridge Mountains. He wondered how relics of sea life came to rest on a mountaintop in Virginia. That curious country boy grew up to write the Declaration of Independence and was governor of Virginia while America fought Britain to gain its freedom. But after America won the war, some across the Atlantic felt the former colony had little to offer. Jefferson knew the truth, and those giant bones would help him prove it. He decided to write a book that would tell the world America was the great country full of great creatures. But describing an animal no living person had seen would not be easy. You see he's looking at a fossil? I love fossils, and as you know, I have some in the library. I think they're so interesting. As the American Philosophical Society, where Jefferson and other men interested in science would meet, some believed the colossal tusk and leg bones being dug up out west belonged to an elephant. Some thought the whopping teeth belonged to a hippopotamus. Others argued the animal was both an elephant and a hippopotamus. In fact, it was a mastodon, but in Jefferson's time it became known as a mammoth, after a similar creature that had been dug up in Siberia. In his book, Jefferson listed the mammoth along with the moose, mountain lion, buffalo, and bears. He wrote that the newly discovered mysterious large big creature still exists in the northern part of America. Now, do you think the mammoth, or quote mastodon, was still alive during that time? Remember, there's a lot of things they didn't know then that we know now. He added a chart listing the weight of American mammals. The space for the mammoth's weight was blank. How much did an unknown animal weigh? If only he could get his hands on a mammoth bone, he could figure it out. Many of his friends owned bones from Big Bone Lick, a salty bog near the Ohio River in Kentucky. Prehistoric animals had come to lick the salt from the mud, gotten stuck, and died. George Washington had a leg bone and a molar. Benjamin Franklin possessed several specimens. Even the King of France displayed a femur, teeth, and a tusk in his private museum. Jefferson had no bones, only a bad case of Mammoth Fever. Jefferson's friend George Rogers Clark lived near the Big Bone Lick. Were it possible to get a tooth, he told Clark, it would be particularly obliging to me. General Clark tried to collect a thigh bone, but it broke as he dug it up. Offering to pay, Jefferson asked for any bones Clark could find. When the general hiked to the lick again, the ground was frozen solid. Nothing would budge. So you probably already know this, but animals need salt just like we do because we're animals. And so I'm not sure if you understood what they said, but they would go down to this area of a mucky kind of swampy area, and they would lick the mud to get salt, and then they would get stuck in the mud. They wouldn't be able to get out, and they would die there, and then their bodies would decompose, and the bones would stay there and turn into fossils. Word spread about Jefferson's keen interest in the mystery animal. He was given a jumbo tooth that came from the salt marsh in southeastern Virginia. It was studded with cone-shaped points. Jefferson marveled at its heaviness and shape. Elephant molars, he knew, were flat-topped for grinding plants. So if it's sharp, what do you think they were eating? Think about it. Was the mammoth a carnivore? He pictured great meat-eating beasts stomping around his native state. He must have more bones. General Clark sent Jefferson a thigh bone. It was as tall as a 3-year-old child, yet this first bone was only fanned his mammoth fever. If he had a whole skeleton, he would know what the creature looked like. In the spring of 1796, Jefferson received a package of fossils from a friend. It held a strange leg and foot bone and, oddest of all, toe bones with giant claws. Look at that. The fossil did not belong to Jefferson's hoped-for mammoth, but a new beast he named Great Claw in a scientific essay. Jefferson thought the animal must be a wild cat 3 times bigger than a lion. He felt certain this giant cat prowled in uncharted forests along with the mammoth. So he's getting these bones, but he doesn't realize that all these animals have long been extinct. He thinks they're still alive out in the wild. In 1797, Jefferson was elected Vice President of the United States of America. Sorry about that. Vice President of the United States and President of the American Philosophical Society. So he's Vice President of the U.S. and President of the Philosophical Society. He traveled to Philadelphia to accept both offices, carrying with him the Great Claw's bone and an essay. It was an honor to be Vice President, yet he was more excited to reveal his scientific discovery. Society members blasted his ideas. Without a thigh bone, how could he know the size of the Great Claw? Why hadn't anyone ever seen one? Jefferson didn't back down. Even when he learned he'd been wrong, that the Great Claw bones actually belonged to a giant sloth, he believed in the possibility of more discoveries. If the mammoth wandered somewhere in the West, what else might be out there? As society president, Jefferson pushed the Bone Committee to set up its research. They needed bones, and lots of them. So, I don't know if you've ever seen a picture of it, but there used to be a giant sloth that wandered around in the U.S. Obviously, it's not alive anymore, but that's where that claw came from. Wouldn't it be cool to be digging somewhere and find a big skeleton like that? I would love it. Then, in 1799, a worker on John Maston's farm in Newburgh, New York, stabbed his shovel into the ground and it struck something hard. The bones of a monster. Lots of them. Jefferson tried to buy the Maston bones. The farmer refused to sell. I mean, look how big these things are. Can you imagine? I mean, those are the rib cage. So your rib cage is right here. The following year, Jefferson became the 3rd president of the United States. He moved into the president's house and a grand new home on Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, D.C., which later became known as the White House. But he didn't forget about his mammoth. A complete skeleton would draw worldwide attention to America's natural wonders. At Jefferson's urging, a fellow society member, Charles Wilson Peel, went to the Maston farm, where he was successful in buying the bones. Peel returned to Philadelphia to assemble the skeleton, adding wooden parts in place of the missing skull top and lower jaw. It measured 17 feet long and 11 feet high at the shoulder, weighing over 1,000 pounds. That's cool, isn't it? I mean, can you imagine finding that when you're out digging up your field so you can plant? Because a lot of farmers lived back then. On Christmas Day, 1801, the mammoth stood in a special room of the American Philosophical Society building. Lit by oil lamps after dark, the hulking creature dwarfed a tiny mouth skeleton posed by its foot to highlight the monster's bulk. People flocked to see the astounding attraction. For 75 cents, they could gawk at, as Peel's poster trumpeted, the bones of the largest of terrestrial beings. Look how giant it is compared to those people. And to think those things used to roam around the United States. Suddenly the whole country caught mammoth fever. Anything oversized was branded mammoth. Newspapers sprouted accounts of 20-pound mammoth radish, mammoth bread for sale, and a mammoth eater, a man who devoured 42 eggs in 2 minutes. Ugh, that sounds terrible. Townspeople in Chelsea, Massachusetts sent Jefferson a mammoth cheese weighing 1,235 pounds. On New Year's Day, 1802, Jefferson opened his house to the public. He greeted the cheese-nibbling visitors, but his thoughts turned west. The United States needed room to grow, he believed, and soon it would. With the 1803 Louisiana Purchase, 828,000 square miles sold by France to America, the country doubled in size, becoming a mammoth nation. So see this part, this kind of bluish part? That was the size of the United States, and then we bought the Louisiana Purchase was from France, and it added twice the size to the United States. And the rest of it, where Texas is, I was going to say where we live, I don't live in Texas anymore, but in Texas, California, and all that, like Utah and Nevada, was all belonged to the Spanish. In 1804, Jefferson sent Meriwether Lewis and William Clark to explore the West. Bring back bones, he instructed, and keep an eye out for the living mammoth. Do you think they're going to bump into a mammoth? They're not, but they don't know that yet. Jefferson asked Lewis to stop at Big Bone Lick on the way and send him back the bones that had recently been dug up. But the boat carrying the fossils to Washington wrecked, and Jefferson's bones sank to the bottom of the Mississippi River. Oh, that's a bummer. By now, his political enemies jeeringly called him Mr. Mammoth. Jefferson didn't care. When Lewis and Clark returned, he sent Clark to Big Bone Lick to look one more time. Clark's first report was disappointing. The salt marsh had been picked over by fossil hunters. But his next report glowed with good news. He had collected 300 bones and teeth. What's more, they were on their way to Washington. So that is kind of a bummer. Back during that time, people were digging around and finding a lot of fossils, and they weren't necessarily taking care of them. Some were damaged, some were lost, and some ended up in private homes, so nobody else ever got to see them. On March 7th, 1808, 3 crates arrived at the president's house. Jefferson had them opened in the East Room, where former First Lady Abigail Adams had once done laundry. This was now the Bone Room. Jefferson spread out more than 300 fossils on the floor. Some belonged to other animal species, but most were from mammoths. Teeth, tusk, one 10 feet long, ribs, leg, and foot bones, and 4 jaw bones and 4 pieces of skulls. All the bones of the American mammoth had now been found. At the end of his second presidential term, Jefferson retired and went home to Virginia. For years, he dreamed of building a university with the study of science at its heart. The foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains, where mammoths once lumbered, would be a good place. Thomas Jefferson died in 1826, a year after making his dream come true. His grandson donated most of Jefferson's fossils to the University of Virginia. Sometime in the middle of the century, however, the bones were lost. There's no record of them after 1848. To this day, no one knows the location of his collection. Oh, that is terrible. I mean, I don't know how you could lose bones that big and that many. I think someone must have stolen them. Maybe someday a student will stumble on a dusty box labeled Mr. Jefferson's Bones. This curious young scholar might open the lid, setting free the spirits of Thomas Jefferson and his beloved mammoth, so they may drift through unknown territory like smoke from ghostly campfires. So this is what they look like. They're pretty cool, aren't they? Now, if you like this book, they give you some information about Jefferson and his history, and then they talk about whether it's a mammoth or a mastodon. And so you can learn more about the science. I love science, and I love fossils, and I love discovering things, and that's super interesting. That's a story I'd never heard of. Can you imagine going to the White House and seeing a giant skeleton like that? That'd be pretty cool. All right, friends, I hope you liked the story. Happy reading.